All right, so now we're going to start session number 3 on the introduction to profiling, focusing on the dichotomies. Once again, dichotomies are pairings of opposites. And just to remind you, there is no such thing as a true dichotomy in nature. Everything is going to bleed into its opposite in some way. However, we're studying them as if they're complete and total opposites so that we can understand them more. And this dichotomy that we're going to be tearing into right now is the thinking and feeling dichotomy. Now, just like people think they understand introversion and extroversion, there is a certain segment of the population that thinks they know what you mean when you use the phrase thinking and feeling in the sense of a person's personality type. There is a lot of misconceptions around what this particular dichotomy represents, though. So we're going to make sure that if you've got a preconception around what thinking and feeling is, that we just sort of remove that preconception and remove that maybe inaccurate concept and reinstall the far more robust and helpful version of thinking and feeling. Because a lot of times the thinking feeling separation creates a massive amount of prejudice when not completely understood. So that's what we're trying to actually remove, is not like, hey, our system is better than what you learned before, but rather this is a lot less prejudicial a way of coming to the same concept or component or information. Now, the intuitive sensing component, most people don't even think about that. That's something not on their radar unless they run into Myers-Briggs test and are tested out as a sensor and intuitive, and then there's all these big ha-has. But in social consciousness, there's really not that big of a concept of what that means. Introversion, extroversion, very much in the social awareness. Thinking, feeling, kind of in the social awareness, kind of. And again, a lot of misconceptions. So we're going to talk about the thinking and feeling split or difference as it is on a fundamental foundational level, just like we did with the previous 2 dichotomies. Now, the very important thing to understand is, just like we talked about with sensing and intuitive, that is how people learn information. That is their perception of how the world works. Thinking and feeling are evaluation styles, all right? These are the criteria we use to make decisions, all right? So we took in information and understood how it worked with a sensing or an intuitive mental process or preference, and now we got to make a decision, all right? My sensing told me this, but now I got to come to a conclusion on it, so what am I going to use? Or my intuition is speculating this, but now what's the right decision to make based on that projection or that pattern recognition? So thinking and feeling are the criteria we use to make those decisions. For introversion, extroversion, it was about a 50-50 split in demographics. For sensing and intuition, it's a 75-25 split, which is by far the most stratified of any of the dichotomies. For thinking and feeling, it's more like a 60-40, maybe even more like a 55-45, favoring feelers. All right, so there are going to be more feelers represented on the planet than thinkers. And the reason for this is that feeling or women have a tendency to favor the feeling evaluation criteria. And so it's more stratified in women. In fact, approximately 75% of women are feelers and only 25% of women are thinkers. Whereas with men, it's a little bit more balanced. It's more of like a 55-45 in men. So when you sort of parse it all down, it means that we're going to have a slight preference on the planet. If you take, everybody on the planet, we're gonna have a slight preference for feelers, but it's not going to be as stratified as it would be, say, for sensors and intuitives, except when you look at women as the demographic, and then it is very stratified. Hopefully that all made sense. All right, so whether you're a thinker or feeler, it indicates your favored method of making judgments and decisions, all right? So how you judge the world. And by judge the world, we don't mean prejudiciously. We mean evaluatively, all right? I'm judging that I should be doing this, or I've judged the situation and this is the right course of action. So that's what we mean when we say it is a way to make judgments and decisions. The distilled difference between thinking and feeling, all right? All thinkers feel and all feelers think. So it can't be whether or not you think and whether or not you feel. Obviously, that couldn't be the difference, because we're all going to be able to do both of those things. We have to be a complete human being. So it's not whether or not you're thinking or feeling. It's whether or not you're using feeling criteria or thinking criteria to make your best decisions. All right. So what is feeling criteria and what is thinking criteria? Well, thinkers prefer impersonal information. They prefer data, metrics, analysis. That's what they prefer as criteria to evaluate information to make decisions. So it's not even so much that they're using their minds or brains. All of us are using our minds and brains when we're making decisions, including feelers. But their criteria is more impersonal. It's more separated. People might be one component in their decision making, but it's not the complete picture. It's more about how this is going to pan out. What are the numbers going to look like? What's the cost benefit ratio? What makes analytical sense? How are all the data pieces lining up? And then I can make an informed, good, solid decision. Feelers, on the other hand, use the impact a decision will have on themselves and other people as the biggest part of their criteria. And this is particularly emotional. It's the emotional impact it will have. And that's why they're called feelers. It's not that they're using their feelings to make decisions. It's that they're asking themselves, how is it going to impact me and other people emotionally? All right, so I'm not using my feeling to make a decision. I'm using my future feelings as a way to determine whether this is a right decision or not. All right, so that's a distinction that's very important. Now, obviously, this means that they're going to use a lot more personal criteria, and they might use metrics in there as well. Like they might use some metrics, data, numbers, etc. But ultimately, those impersonal criteria get folded into the personal criteria, just like the personal criteria for a thinker gets folded into the impersonal. So it's how personal and impersonal your criteria is when you're making a decision. When a feeler is making a decision and says, I think this decision is going to impact my family in this way, they're using a thinking process, right? Or they're using their minds, not a thinking process, but they're using their minds to make that decision. If you ask them to write down a list of all the reasons why this is the best decision to make, that this criteria is great for, for their family, for themselves, for their friends, for humanity in general, they could probably write down a list, a very analytical list. Okay, so if I do this, this is how it's going to impact my children, and if I do this, it'll impact my husband in this way, and so that's the right decision to make. So it's not that it's emotive, emotional, unable to be, sort of figured out on an analytical level. It's that the criteria has a distinctly emotional impact focus. Thinkers, the criteria has a distinctly impersonal impact focus, all right? All thinkers feel, all feelers think. That's very important to understand the difference. And that's why when somebody comes out as a feeler and they don't see themselves as quote unquote emotional or emotive, they'll resist you. They'll say, I'm not a feeler, I'm a thinker, right? Because they think that thinking means using their brain, and they think that feeling means only leading with your heart. And that's not the distilled difference between the two. It's very important to understand this, especially when you profile somebody and all of a sudden you get this massive resistance. Same thing with thinkers. They'll say, I'm not a thinker. I'm actually I'm very connected with people. Well, it's not whether or not you're connected with people. I'm a thinker. I'm very connected to people. I love connecting with people. Very satisfying to connect with people. That said, when it comes right down to it and I have to make a decision, people are one piece of the puzzle, and there's all these other components that are just as important a piece of the puzzle for me. So really getting that distinction is very important. All right, so because this is their criteria, just like with sensors and intuitives, it is going to color a lot of different behavioral components. They're going to show up a little different. And it's also going to color not just how they're showing up behaviorally, but also sort of what strategies, not sort of, but the strategies they've used to get to their goals quicker. All right. For example, thinkers will act more cool socially. They'll be more distant and they won't jump to connection. All right, they won't jump to connection. Whereas feelers have a tendency to be more friendly. They have a tendency to be more warm. They enjoy connection. They seek it out. They're looking to connect with you right away if possible. And the reason for this is not that the feelers are oh so emotional and the thinkers are oh so brainiac. It's that for a thinker, if your best decision making comes from impersonal criteria, you're not going to want to jump to connect because that's going to muddy the water of your decision making, right? It's just going to confuse you. If you're constantly connecting with other human beings and their emotions and how they're being impacted emotionally are like forever on your radar, then when it comes time that you have to make a decision, you're going to have all this emotional consideration on your mind, and you're not going to be able to get to the cool, rational place. Now, what defines a thinker versus a feeler is what helps the individual, based on their wiring, what helps the individual make their best decisions. When a thinker is using impersonal criteria, that's when they make their best decisions, and not just selfishly, not just for them, but for everyone. Everyone benefits when a thinker is being cool and impartial when they're making their decisions. And the same thing with a feeler. It's not that feelers are just oh so emotive. It's that everybody benefits when they're making decisions based on personal criteria. Our wiring will reward us when we honor it. Okay, I want to repeat that. Our wiring will reward us when we honor it. And that means that our wiring will reward thinkers. It will reward thinkers for making cool impersonal decisions. And our wiring will reward feelers for making personal criteria decisions. Okay, does that make sense? We want to check in with the chat room. Our wiring rewards us when we honor it. Make sense? So, strategies come from that, and the behavior is an attempt to honor the process. Our behavior naturally evidences or emerges to put us in a position to make those wiring honoring decisions. So our behavior is strategy to make those good decisions. So thinkers make better decisions when they don't jump to connect, and feelers make better decisions when they jump to connect. All right, and that's why this manifests. Thinkers will be more interested in your information and your data. Right? That makes sense. If they're making decisions based on information and data, they're going to want to get as much of it as they can. So when they engage with a person, if a person is, say, well educated on a topic, or they have a lot of information in something that the thinker doesn't have, a thinker will totally zoom in on that person and be like, wow, just tell me, let's do a Vulcan mind meld. Tell me everything that you've got, because that's interesting. I want more data and information. Whereas a feeler is not going to be as interested in the data. They're going to be more interested in you as a person. They're going to want to know what your personal story is, because that way they can break down or sort of deconstruct how people feel about things. And so in the future, when they've got to make a decision and maybe you're part of their decision, they will already have your personal story sort of in their mind to know, okay, well, I think this is going to impact that person this way because I know their history. I know how they feel about their upbringing, etc. Now, thinkers won't just nod when listening, because every piece of information you give to them is going through sort of a vetting process. They're kind of going, huh, that's interesting. What do I think about that? Is that gelling with what I already know? That's interesting. Whereas a feeler is going to be encouraging of you because they want to connect to get to that emotional component. They want you to reveal your emotional self to them. So they'll nod in encouragement, right? They'll go, yeah, totally. Keep going. Keep telling me what's going on with you. Keep letting me know what is in your heart. Thinkers have a tendency, they can be tactless, right? They value truth over tact, because truth is that's one of the nodes in the system for making good decisions. We don't want emotions over clouding things. We don't want it muddying the waters. So I'm going to favor truth over making you feel good. Whereas a feeler will do the opposite, because they're making their best decisions when you are feeling good and when they know what makes you feel good, then they have a tendency to favor tact over truth. Obviously, this is not 100%. This is a bell curve. We're looking at it in a sort of a zoomed out. This is mostly how it works. There are going to be some people who are feelers that I've heard feelers say things like, well, I just tell it how it is. Well, usually when somebody's a feeler and says that, I find them actually being quite diplomatic, unless they're around friends who they know won't be offended by them saying that. Right? And sometimes they'll say a truth and it will be offensive, and they usually feel bad about it, right? Whereas a thinker isn't even, they usually don't need to broadcast that they tell it how it is. They just do, and everybody knows that about them. And they hope that people will hold space for that. Now, thinkers can have stronger executive ability. This makes sense because they're more about the results. Oftentimes, not all thinkers are going to have good executive ability, but they have a tendency to be a little bit more strong in the executive component, whereas feelers have a tendency to be more strong in the political component. They're a lot better at being diplomats and politicians and bringing people together and bridging them, whereas thinkers are a little bit better at getting something done when they need to, get people to to help them achieve that end. Thinkers are more likely to question other people's conclusions. That makes sense. A thinker is trying to figure out how all this data pans out. They're trying to figure out how, well, what is, this person gave me all this information, this sounded right, but this didn't, and I want to get to the bottom of that. So tell me why you came to that conclusion. Tell me why you think that, the information and data you gave to me, tell me why that came to the conclusion that you came to, because I'm not really sure if I'm seeing that. It's not actually an attempt to discredit the other person. Sometimes thinkers can be jerks, and they will do that. However, for the most part, when the thinker is doing that, is not an attempt to, I don't know, create some sort of intellectual hierarchy. It is generally because they really authentically, honestly want to know the information that led you to the conclusion that you got to. They're vetting information for themselves all the time, so they're going to do it with your information as well. Whereas a feeler is less likely to do that because the information content isn't as important. The connection is the important thing. Keeping connected and keeping in sort of an emotional intimacy space, if possible, is how they make better decisions, right? Because then they're going to know where you're at emotionally, and getting your emotional needs met is a little bit more on their radar. So they have a tendency to, or they're less likely to basically, I don't know, put you on the spot questioning a conclusion, or however, however they, if you come to a conclusion that they don't understand, they're probably going to be a lot more tactful about trying to figure that out, but that's not really what their primary focus is. Thinkers behaviorally, all right, in tonality, in how they talk, in sort of, when you're trying to spot them in the wild. Thinkers are more likely to have a steady gaze and speak in a monotone. Now, when I'm teaching, I have had training in the past that tells me to be engaging and have a lot of gestures, mannerisms, have some energy in there, and that will keep people engaged when you're teaching content. That said, if you listen to my voice, whenever I get to a point where I'm really trying to nail something, I'm really trying to go, okay, I'm landing the plane now and you need to listen, my voice will get very monotone, like this. Right? And I'll repeat that, and my voice will maintain a monotone cadence. Now, the reason why I do that is because as a thinker, the more monotone I get, the more serious I am, the more I think it's important information. Thinkers have a tendency to have a monotone, especially when they're trying to make a point. Feelers, on the other hand, are less monotone. They're more sing-songy. Even if they're a very quiet feeler, you'll still hear a very pleasant sort of up and down quality to their voice, and it's because they are crafting their voice to be pleasing to the listener, whereas the thinker is simply crafting their voice to relay and to gain information. Not simply, not only, not exclusively, as a tendency, as a preference. And one really interesting thing about thinkers is that they will see emotions. It's not that they invalidate all emotions. However, if an emotion doesn't make sense to them, if they can't figure out why somebody would feel that way, they have a tendency to just sort of, I don't know, invalidate it. It's just like, well, I don't understand why somebody would feel that way, so I'm not going to acknowledge or recognize it. Now, what's interesting is that they do this in themselves and others. And oftentimes when a thinker isn't doing this, it's because they've done some work around emotional intelligence. It's because they've focused on it. If they haven't focused on it, a thinker is a lot more likely to say, your problems are dumb and your feelings are stupid. I've heard thinkers actually quote that. And they're doing it facetiously, but that's, it's kind of how they feel. Whereas a feeler will always see an emotion as valid. They might not fully understand it. They might not agree with why the person is feeling the way they are, and yet the feeling is real and it is valid because it is being felt. So feelers have a lot more space. They hold a lot more space for when somebody is going through an emotional experience, even if they don't understand or gel with it, whereas a thinker will have less patience with an emotion that they don't personally understand. And it makes sense that thinkers are going to be more business-like in conversation. They're going to choose words that are more get down to brass tacks, whereas a feeler is going to be a lot more personal and less business-oriented, even in a business context. So these are some of the major differences between thinkers and feelers when they, sort of manifest, or what gets behaviorally manifest from that distillation of what's my criteria for making decisions. They naturally come up with behavioral strategies that will meet the need of their wiring. And that makes sense. Again, our wiring rewards us when we honor it. All right, let's talk about thinkers and feelers in the wild. They're sometimes some of the easiest to spot, all right? Like the introvert extrovert, most people in the bell curve are going to be easy to spot. There's going to be some people at the two sides of the bell curve which are really difficult to spot. When I talk about the bell curve, I usually talk about things like the health of the individual. If they're incredibly unhealthy or if they're incredibly healthy, sometimes it's more difficult to figure out what their type is because they folded in a lot more, growth and attention to sort of balancing out, and we'll talk about how that works later on when we talk about health in type. That said, most people that are introverts or extroverts are going to be a little bit more obvious. Sensors and intuitives, a little more difficult because a lot of intuitives are blending, but if you really listen to those cues that refer to abstractions, you're going to be able to pick that up too. However, thinkers and feelers, like introverts and extroverts, they're a little more easy to spot. It's a little easier to tell when somebody's a thinker or a feeler, but sometimes, just sometimes, just remember sometimes, thinkers are generally less expressive, both in facial expression and in tonality. Remember that monotone we talk about? Their gaze is steadier. They make fewer sympathetic noises, and by sympathetic noises, I mean noises like, ah. Right, that's a sympathetic noise. Now, I'll admit, if you show something that's profoundly cute in front of me, I will have a tendency to go, that's adorable. But that's not an awe, right? It's not like an awe. And thinkers just have a tendency to feel less, they give themselves less permission to be emotionally expressive. That's another big thing, is permission. Thinkers don't have as much internal permission to be emotionally expressive, so they're going to be more conservative with how they do that. So there's going to be less sympathetic noises. They're going to have a more controlled demeanor. So when we talked about introverts and extroverts, I talked about how extroverts have the louder gestures. However, a thinker that's also an extrovert will still have those louder gestures, but they're going to be sort of staccato, punctuated gestures. Does that make sense? They're going to be kind of controlled. They're going to be a little bit more terse in their physical gestures. Whereas a feeler, just like they've constructed their voice to be pleasant to the listener, they're constructing their movements to be more graceful as a general rule, to be more pleasing to the visual component of the person talking to them. So a feeler's gestures are going to be a little bit more fluid, and a thinker's gestures are going to be a little bit more jerky as a rule. And thinkers generally dress for comfort and utility, whereas feelers are more expressive in their dress. Now, this is not always the case. Sometimes thinkers are very expressive. But again, thinkers are not as interested in how their behavior is impacting you in sort of a level of like pleasingness. A thinker isn't going to be dressing for how pleasing it is to the people around them. It's more going to be about utility. It's going to be more about, if it's expressive, it's going to be like, it's maybe that punk style where like it's really like gothic or maybe aggressive or whatever. They'll wear shirts that are representative of, I don't know, you can see like guys in IT that have like, shirts that you may or may not understand because it's such an in-joke, but it's to tell you a message, which is that you may or may not be in, right? You might not be one of the cool kids, but it's certainly not to it's to impress you, but not to be pleasing to you. Whereas a feeler is a lot more likely, again, to construct things to be pleasing to their audience. So they're going to be a lot more expressive, but in a pleasing way, and it will feel more effortless as well. Feelers are more supportive in conversation. They're more connective. They're usually more touchy-feely. Not every feeler is touchy-feely. They could have, maybe some healing work to do around that, or they might just not be as expressive physically. And yet, at the same time, when they are more touchy-feely, when they are more physically expressive, it usually does them good, right? It helps them connect. Whereas a thinker is usually not as touchy-feely. Now, some are. I know some thinkers that will hug everybody that comes into their eye line, and that's totally fine. That said, they're probably not going to be touchy-feely in the same way that the feeler is. The feeler is touchy-feely, once again, to be pleasing to the audience, whereas a thinker might have created a strategy around this that they know is, it works for them and for the other person. So the behavior might be the same, but they're coming at it from completely different ways. All right, so this is the thinking feeling difference, and it's really important to understand that this is not about being cerebral or being emotional. And when you're doing profiling sessions, this is one of the most important things to relay to the people that you're profiling if they have a prejudice around thinking, feeling. This is not about being cerebral or emotional. It's about the criteria you're using to make decisions. It goes beyond the usage of your brain and the heart. This is what you spent your life programming your mind to spot as important, all right? You programmed your mind to spot certain things as being important. That's important criteria. I got to go chase it. And for a thinker, it's different criteria than for a feeler. And so all the emergent behaviors or strategies that your mind has used so you can go chase the proper criteria for making your decision. And what you pay attention to when you determine things like rightness and goodness, all right? It's not like feelers are interested in ethics and thinkers aren't. They're both interested in ethics. They're just chasing different rabbits down different holes to come to the conclusion of what is right and good. Now, I just want to create a distinction right now between the dichotomy of thinking and feeling and the dichotomy of sensing and intuition. And we'll be building on these blocks, all right, really soon when we get to cognitive functions. But did you notice that when we talked about sensing and intuiting, we talked about perceiving the world, we talked about learning how the world works? For thinking and feeling, we're not talking about perceiving how the world works. We're talking about determining how it should work. All right, what decision do I need to make? What am I going to put out to the world? What do I think is right and good? And both thinking and feeling is trying to figure that out. They're both interested in decisions, evaluating final calls. Sensing and intuiting is more open frame. It's more about engaging, learning, understanding, figuring out. Thinking and feeling is about coming to a conclusion. All right, so these are two different styles of engagement with the world, and we'll really be building on that when we talk about cognitive functions. All right, for those of you interested in profiler training certification, here is your exercise. Listen in on a conversation between a thinker and a feeler. It's okay if you're one of the people in the conversation. So if you're a thinker or a feeler and you're one of the people in the conversation, just sort of take a meta perspective and be listening to yourself talking to somebody of a different preference in this dichotomy. How could you tell it was a conversation between a thinker and a feeler? How can you tell, right? Was it what they said, how they said it, their tonality, how they were dressed? Was it the content of what they were talking about? Was it the conclusions they came to? Was it their, gestures? How did you know it was a thinking and a feeling conversation? And was there a disagreement, all right? Were they able to see each other's viewpoints? If there was a disagreement because they came to different conclusions, is it because one of them was coming to a feeling conclusion and the other one was coming to a thinking conclusion? And were they able to understand where each other was coming from? And if they did, who was the person who tried to figure out the other person's perspective? How did their decision-making preference affect their opinions? All right. How did their decision-making preference, thinking or feeling, affect their opinions? And what I want you to do is, again, in the members area, I want you to write down your observations. And these exercises, by the way, will be in the members area posted so that you will have the exercises available to you so that you can just, read them quickly if you haven't been able to write them down quick enough. All right, so that is the session on the dichotomy between thinking and feeling. What we're going to launch into is the session on the dichotomy of judging and perceiving next.